Vikram, for that generous introduction. Um, I'll answer your question first with the essay that Isaiah Berlin wrote about fox knows many things, but a hedgehog knows one deep thing. So I guess I was going to describe you as a hedgehog chartered accountant, but given your interest in handlooms and other things, maybe you're a fox too. But today I'd like to talk to you. Faith interests me a lot because I think it is a source of our identity for some of us, and for some of us who choose to disdain it or walk away from it too, it looms large in the imagination. Um, so I was trying to, I looked at how we do put our matrimonial advertisements, for example. And usually faith, whatever faith we belong to leads the paragraph, whether it's Christian bride or Muslim bridegroom or Hindu bridegroom. And then we have a full protocol of how we approach it. And then I looked at some profiles in Tinder and Bumble, and I actually looked through a few hundred, and faith doesn't appear. And I was so, as you might have guessed, it is usually, I like Star Wars films, I like pizza and dal chawal, I like the monsoons. So, and since I had the same trajectory where I grew up in a devout Hindu household and then thought it would be cool to become question everything, become atheist, become agnostic, and then now I've come back full circle, much to my mother's delight, and I call myself a Hindu. So faith linked to identity, and faith linked to identity is a country's identity too, as we see now in Turkey, in India, and many other cultures. Faith linked to myths, some of the best artwork, whether it is the Baroque artwork in Italy that derives entirely from Christianity, whether it is the Mughal, the paintings of the Navarasas, the sculpture, the Chola bronzes. So faith has given rise to powerful human emotions. And then I said, how does one approach faith in a way that suits me? As somebody who is a seeker, not fully convinced. And food seems to be a very acceptable, delicious, of course, and low-key way of approaching it. So that's what happened. So in 2015, I pitched my editor, Sukumar, who runs HT Media, and I said, I want to write a book. I want to write about faith and food. And to my delight, he approved the project. And then I started visiting temples. Coming up with a list of temples was itself an exercise because I didn't want to include what I call rock star temples like Guruvayur or Tirupati. I wanted to spotlight temples from different parts of the country. And some temples are an obvious miss. Christianity is a reach because they don't have prasadams or prasad. Even though in my neighborhood, there is the Feast of St. Mary's and Belangani has a feast in the Christian faith, it's not actually a prasad, it is a feast. And then Jainism is an obvious miss. So with those caveats, I would like to share a PowerPoint presentation for about 20 minutes, and then I can talk about it. I also want to spotlight one thing before I begin the presentation. One thing that interests me was that whether faith, and this may interest Vikram and Ajay, is faith linked to economy? For example, I find that cultures that become economically more powerful leave behind vestiges of what sustained them in the past. China, and this is documented, its citizens consider themselves about 90% atheist. So Scandinavian countries, you can say 87%. Japan, 87%. So the most devout countries are in Africa, Nigeria, Ghana. So then I started wondering, will there be an expiry date for faith? Will we as a species, as humans, decide that We don't need God because we've made money. There are two exceptions to this trajectory that links economy with religion. The logic being that as you get more prosperous, you give up your faith. America is on that trajectory too. The two exceptions that I found are Thailand and India, where only 15% of our population call themselves atheist. And I started wondering, why is it that Indians are still devout, even though we are a developing economy, and the same with Thailand. And I'll give you my answer in the presentation. Can you all see? Okay.
Yeah, we can see. Go ahead.
So I want to start at Udupi, which is in my neck of the woods, the Sri Krishna temple in Udupi. I have visited it many times because my mother's Ishta Devata is Kollur Mukambika. So we have a round, we go to Udupi and then go to Mukambika in Kollur and come back. And Udupi temple, on January 18th typically in January, they do what is called a Bale Muhurta. The Udupi temple is run by Ashtamatas or 8 maths, and every 2 years there is a Paryaya, which is a transfer of power. And one of the matas gives it to the other. And in the run-up to the 2-year transfer of power date, there are 4 muhurtas actually. There is the Akki, which is the rice muhurta, the Bale muhurta, where you plant Bale trees, which is the banana trees. There's the Kattige muhurta, which is the for wood, and the Batta, which is paddy. And the Akki muhurta, here you see people carrying 18 different varieties of rice. These are all local rice with beautiful names like Tanu, Sindhu, Padmareka, Raja Kammala. And so this brings us to the first point of why there is prasadam. I'm going to use the South Indian way of calling it prasadam, if that's okay. And the North Indians say prasad. So the prasadam in Udupi, one of the ostensible reasons is to preserve ancient and indigenous varieties of rice. This is the Kattige Muhurta, where the wood is shaped in a very beautiful way to be used for the firewood, which is how they cook. And this is the Batta. So temples are excellent at preserving many things, one of which is traditional indigenous food. Unlike us who have ended up eating Sona Masuri rice or Basmati for the most part of it, the foods surrounding temples are indigenous. And India used to have 1 lakh varieties of rice, as you perhaps know. And this is the local pumpkin. They use colocasia, they use yams, they use a particular brinjal called mattagulla, and of course they use akki or rice. And this is because anyone who comes to Udupi temple gets fed, because Lord Krishna there is called Anna Brahma. And this is my prasadam, which is very humble but very tasty, largely rice-based and made with saru or local local brinjal. And here is the place where people eat. And I asked this old man in this photograph, I said, I've been here a few days and I see you every time. And what are you doing here? And he said, this is my seva. It gives me purpose. And so I thought, for people like me who are skeptical and kind of wonder about faith, the power of this man's faith gives him a certain transcendence, gives him a certain purpose. And if you look at all these self-help books these days, whether it is business self-help books, it is entirely about purpose, organizational purpose, individual purpose. And for many devotees, that's the other thread that I saw running through all the temples, is that if you are faithful, you become part of something larger than you are, and it gives you purpose. Now we go to Haridwar. This is not this Kumbh Mela, but it was about a decade ago, actually, 2011. And this is Harihar Puri. He's from the man on the right. He belongs to the Juna Akhada. Shankaracharya traversed the country and created akhadas, one of which is the Juna Akhada. And he says, I am here to defend the Hindu faith. and that he lives in the mountains. He ran away from his home in Bihar, and now this is what he does. He is a Baba who defends the Hindu faith. So again, we come to purpose. This is what he lives for. This is his identity is entirely linked to his religion. This man, he's actually a friend of mine who is from Karnataka. He visits every Kumbh. I haven't called him to ask him if he has gone to this last one, but he too told me that he is a widower. He lost his wife very tragically, and going to the Kumbh Mela gives him solace. And now we come to Swami Avdeshananda, who runs the Harihar Ashram, one of the biggest ashrams in Haridwar in the Kankal neighborhood. And this is how he looks. And naturally, the rational part of me who has read about God-man in many avatars is very skeptical. And I say, okay, here we go, one more God-man playing the politician. He has protection. He has gun-toting men who follow him. He has, and this is how he receives his guests. People come and ask him. This woman asked him, Swamiji, I want to meet Shiva. This was her question. And he is there holding her hand. Before COVID, this was offering her an answer. Because like a good politician, he sees the question, but he sees the deeper yearning behind the question. And then, so just as I was about to dismiss him, he did something. He went to we were a posse of journalists following him around with our cameras and everything. He said, just give me a minute. And he goes to the Rudraksh tree, which is the oldest one in Haridwar, and he does puja. So he puts a little flowers, he puts water, he hugs it quite literally, and then he prays to it. And he says, I do this every day because once you start hugging a tree or praying to a tree, you will not bespoil the earth. So again, environmentalism, sustainability, and this is me being skeptical, but he says, I don't throw flowers into the Ganga. I don't throw candles or deep diyas into the Ganga. My way is to connect with nature. So after I came back from this trip, I was wondering, did humans invent religion as a way of originally connecting with nature, as a way of making sense of nature? Because if you look at our old gods, the Indra, the Rudra, they were all linked to the Panchabhutas or the nature. So if you imagine us as nomads crossing from Africa to the continents, and you have a thunderstorm and you have lightning and you want to make sense of it, how do you make sense of it? I guess the way most faiths made sense of it, from the Greek mythologies to the Roman. If you look at pagan faiths before the monotheistic religions, pagan faiths were nature worshippers. And I think nature worship is a way of subduing nature, or rather making sense of nature and bringing it closer to us, to remove the fear, which is the original, in my view, the reason why humans invented religion is to kind of allay our fears. And then we go to Kashi, Ganga Mata, as you call it. Faith. And this is a photograph in which I want to tell you why I think faith in India will not have an expiry date. Because like Vikram mentioned, faith is, our religion is woven into our fabrics. Whether you look at the Annapakshi or the Rudraksha that are there in your beautiful Gadwal or Pochampalli saris, it is there in the way we arrange our flowers, in the choice of the flowers. On Ganapati, for Ganapati, you use certain flowers. For the Kamala, and Kamala is now the Vice President of the United States. So our names, our foods, our handlooms, our necklaces. For example, in Karnataka, there is a Ganda Berunda, or the double-headed bird motif. So faith, how can you remove religion from India without removing its culture? And this is, of course, the snake charmer in Kashi near Assi Ghat. And snake charming originated in India and then traveled to Egypt, and there is mention of it in the Bible. And there is a book called Prakrit, the language of the snakes. And in India, Sanskrit was the language of the gods, and Prakrit was the language of the humans. And snakes hold a huge portion of the Indian imagination because of the patalas, the way we worship it in our language. So here we are in Kashi. And then the second aspect of religion, which is my mother, when I asked her, what are the two things that you would say are benefits of faith? What are two things you need? She said bhavna or imagination and sharanagati or self-surrender. Bhavna is looking at this image and seeing the dirt next to the river and still considering her pure. So you have pavitrata and gandagi, and that is two types of images that come out of the Ganga. But you ignore the Gandagi and you still consider her pavitrata. That is a flight of imagination. And that for any creative person is a useful skill to have. From there, we go to Jagannath Kshetra in Puri. Here too, there is bhavna. I was not allowed into the temple kitchen. This is actually in a museum nearby. There are 752 earthen pots. There are, it's a very tantric shrine too, because they say, for example, that one of the swaras or the cooks told me, if I believe for even 1 minute that I am making the prasad, the pots will chatter. We believe that Mahalakshmi, the consort of Jagannath, is the one who is making the food, and we actually hear her anklets. So that is the power of faith, is the imagining the anklets of the goddess as she walks around the kitchens cooking the food. And so they do 9 pots. 9 is a very powerful tantric. I'm part of a lineage called Sri Vidya, which is the goddess worshipping lineage. And 9 is very important. And so they have 9 pots. The first 3 pots are the pulses, and then the next 3 will be the rice, and then the vegetables. And then there's a yantra drawn below the pots. And then they're all stacked up and cooked, slow cooking, which is what nowadays all our restaurant chefs claim they are doing at its best. Here too, do you see the similarity between the vegetables here and the vegetables of Udupi? Pulses, local, and this is the final result. This photo was taken at Ananta Vasudeva temple in Bhubaneswar, because again, I couldn't access the kitchens in Puri, but they use mud, they use wood fire, and they use wood for the rathas, and the same concept that is followed in Udupi is followed here. Tree saplings are planted by the million so that you can get the wood. The wood crops are specific crops, indigenous crops, local seed varieties are planted so that you can feed the Chappan Bhog. Because you see, in the Hindu mythology, Lord Vishnu, he has a bath in Rameshwaram, then comes to dine in Jagannath Kshetra, goes and prays for the welfare of humanity in Badrinath, and then goes to sleep in Dwarka. So this temple is very, very important for the feeding. And then you go to the Anand, you buy it from these families of cooks who make their living from it. And from there we go to the Ajmer Dargah. Ajmer is a seat of Sufism, and William Chittick, who is a scholar in Tehran, he talks about Sufism as an interiorization and intensification of Islam, by which he means that Sufis believe that they seek Tawheed. I'm not pronouncing it right perhaps, but union with the God. And this is the Kesari Bath. Again, it is broken wheat, ghee, sugar, dry fruits. 4 ingredients made in large quantities. And here too, do you see how our sense of beauty, our sense of aesthetics, our culture, the choice, how we do the sutra. For any Hindu woman, the Mangala Sutra is the most important ornament that we wear around our neck when we get married. Here, the sutra is hung, and the design too. So it is difficult to remove. I guess what I'm saying is shrines are embodiments of culture, of Indian aesthetics, of Indian beauty, Indian music. And then, of course, every shrine, and no matter which part of the world you go to, you have the foibles of the humans that come through. So here, this man who's gazing at the camera approached me, like the pandas approached me in Jagannath Kshetra, like the butts approached me in Mukambika and said, "Madam, you want VIP darshan? You can come on the side, give me some money, and I will take you in." So one of the questions I ask in the book is, these priests are supposed to be holier than thou, and yet why are they doing this? And I give an answer in the book, which I'll come to later, because it irritates the hypocrisy of godmen and priests irritated me. And so then here, this is all of us getting ready for a Qawwali concert, and not concert, it was at the Dargah. And the singers with tears rolling around their rolling down their eyes and calling to Allah, affected me profoundly. I think it would affect anyone profoundly, because whether it's gospel music or Sufi music or bhakti music, the chants and the way the intonation and the chandas and the rhythm happens, that is very similar. And then here are so why do we need God? I think, why do we seek God? To me, a common reason why people turn to faith is when, to use a teenager term, something happens. And usually there is a bad word associated with that. When life throws a monkey wrench to you, when you cannot control it, you turn to God. And here you see the hopes and dreams of every human displayed. There is a cradle, there is a house, somebody wants a child, somebody wants a house, somebody wants a promotion, there's a pot, there's a kumbha, there's jewelry, there's a fan, and there's a hand. So all our dreams and hopes are encapsulated on this in this image. So from Ajmer, we go to South India, to Madurai, where the Madurai Meenakshi temple is very famous, and she is a rock star goddess. I went there, and then one of the priests said, "You are writing about prasadams, you should go to the Aragar Kovil nearby." And that temple is much less known, and you should all go if you visit Madurai, because they have a savory prasadam, which is unusual. And here I want to play, let me give you the context of the next one. So there I met a priest called Madhavan, and Madhavan is running from 3 a.m. to 11 p.m. And I'm trying to interview him, and I'm following him. And he is doing everything that we all associate with priests. So there is a group from Chennai, they want VIP darshan. Another group comes in, they want to fix a date for their daughter's wedding. So he has to sit with them for a few minutes. He's trying to make me comfortable in the middle. He's saying, go have lunch in the temple kitchen. I mean, where mere mortals like me can eat. And then I say, listen, I need to interview you. And he says, okay, I have to do my Sandhya Vandanam, and then I will get ready for the evening worship. After bath, you come and see me there. So this is,
has taken the Simhavadara to protect Dharma in our Bharat. All saints and Brahma, the Devas, Brahma, Shiva, Indra, and 33 crores of Devas requested Lord Mahavishnu to protect Dharma from Hiranyasura, from the check.
So I felt like sitting in the green room of an actress, because there he was getting ready for the evening worship and talking to me. And that's really all the time he had. And this goes on through the day. So my view, my sort of view of, these priests are money grabbing, changed a little bit after watching how he operated. And this is what he does for a living. He gets a very meager salary from the temple, and all his income comes from what we might sort of skeptically call tips from the devotees. But this is the prasadam, and this Chellappa is the cook. And this is a savory prasadam called the Aragar Kovil Dosai. It's a deep fried one. And it is like, I asked them, what is the origin of the savory prasadam? He said, in Tirupati, you have the Tirumal Vadai. This is the bigger version of it. And the one that's off, this is for sale for the devotees. The one that's offered to the god is size of a car tire. And here too, you see these two women, widows, who come to this temple every day to offer their services, thus getting transcendence, sense of purpose, a sense of community, and some joy. So every temple you see men and women who align themselves with that God and gain a reason for living. And this is the sale of the Vada, Aragar Kovil Dosai, 40 rupees a pop. And from then we go to Nepal, to Patan, where this Buddhist master in the middle, he's a Rinpoche, he's a high level master. He has people in Stanford University that work with him on Buddhism, and he's here to make a film on Dakini. And the director is Italian, she's to the right, the producer is to the left. So it's a multi-group. The cinematographer was Chinese. So this gentleman was telling me about Dakinis. And he said, Hinduism, by and large, has sanitized female goddesses. If you look at your Lakshmi, if you look at your Saraswati, they're all viewed as mothers, givers of wealth and largesse. But Hinduism also has, as we know, the Kali, the Dakini, as he will describe, and they are the krodha. They have anger, they are feisty, they have rage. But I will come to the Dakinis. This is the Kumari of Nepal. She lives in Kathmandu as well, and also in Patan, which is where I was visiting. Patan was earlier called Lalitapura, or the abode of goddess Lalita, and Lalita means one who plays. So Kumari, my guide here, who's the man leaning, I asked him, what can I take as an offering? And he said, she's a young child, you take Horlicks. So I took a Horlicks, which she's holding. And then this is the temple there. And here too, if you go around the temple, you will see the paddy. And the one on the right is the ghats where the dead are cremated. But on the left, you will see around the temple where the food is preserved. And it happened during Navratri, and the whole community gathered to celebrate what they call Dasen. And you will see prasadam or food being offered to men who dress as women. And the entire Patan comes together to offer this to the goddesses. This is Chinnamasta, one of my favorite gods, because she's like what we might now call a badass woman. She dances on a corpse and has basically cut off her head. But these are the fierce goddesses that Rinpoche admires, and Dakini is one of them. And he said he's making a film about a man who is going to die unless he finds a Dakini. So that's the film that he was. Then we come to Mathura for the peda. I'm just going to, and samosas, my favorite desert island food. If I could eat one thing every day of my life, it would be a samosa. But here you have the Mathura peda. And in line with the milk thread, here we come to Ambalapura in Kerala for the pal payasam. Ambalapura pal payasam this is one of the priests who make it from the Goshala. And same simple recipe like the Kesariya Bath of Ajmer, stirred for hours in a large urali. And what touched me was before the prasadam was taken to the god, this particular man would go near the temple tank, which is just outside the kitchen, and he would call Vasudeva, Vasudeva, like that, as if the god would come and take it. This too is bhavana, this too is imagination. This is what creative people long to cultivate. And nearby in Kottarakara, they make the unni appams for Ganapati. Huge kitchen, all of them making this. And again, the theme of Indian aesthetics, how beautiful this is, and the oil lamps, the colors of India, all are linked to a sense of beauty. I included Payani because it's a tribal god, Murukkan or Muruga. Is an old god, and he's a Siddha god. This woman is doing an Anga Pradakshanam. And the Panchamritam is made from 4,448 herbs. And it is, and 9 of them are very important, and they are called Nava Pashanam. Pashanam is poisons in a way. But the Siddhas who created this Payani temple, in fact, the image is made of these herbs and sort of congealed. So they will tell you, you take the Abhisheka Panchamritam, Mama, because that is poured over this Siddha idol, and has the benefits of that. Don't buy the non-Abhisheka Panchamrita. And this is where it is made with country sugar, simple recipe of this Malavaraparam or country banana, lots of it. And they take great pains to tell you that the human hand does not touch this Panchamritam and it's all automated. And then we go to Jaipur. I like North Indian temples a lot compared to our South Indian ones for one reason, because the nade or the opening is wide and allows for a lot of people to gather and pray. Unlike, say, if you go to Tirupati or Madurai Meenakshi, the priests sort of rush you along. Here on the right is the Jaipur temple, and it sort of looks like a rock concert. When the shrine is opened, everybody puts up their hands and dances. This is the Banke Bihari temple, and then Golden Temple. I finally come to the Golden Temple, which to me epitomizes the notion of prasad, which is sacred food, holy food, and the langar, where people submerge their ego, come and participate in seva. And I foolishly, for a Tamilian, offered my services making roti and completely goofed it up. I couldn't even do a round one, but the women there were very nice and they taught me. And here is the main place just before the langar goes into the feeding halls. There are the men presiding over it. And I thought this was a good example of service, because you had these rich businessmen, everybody, egalitarianness coming together and washing somebody else's dishes, dirty dishes, and the langar. And I want to end by what I found was a key element of faith and food, which is a sense of transcendence, a sense of losing yourself. Music can give you that. When you go to a live concert, art can give you that. For a moment, you just forget yourself. This man in Ajmer, this cook in Ajmer, they're all part of something that they view as bigger than themselves, and they lose themselves. This woman, she was just sitting there in Ambalappuzha for, I don't know, half an hour, completely at peace, forgotten her worries. Clearly, she's a widow, probably does not have a great life, but she seems serene. This woman in Parni, also a widow, also thrown out by her family, she told me. She sells trinkets and she says, Murga will take care of me. And this one is in Nepal, in Patan. And this is my daughter, who is a 21st century teenager, but in Kashi, you can see she's calm. The Ganga has made her very calm. And so there you have it, food and faith. I'll stop screen sharing now. And I want to show you my book. That's it.
What a fascinating journey you took us into, Shobha. Thank you so very much. This was absolutely wonderful and highlighted 100 things we had not known before. So this was very, very good. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Before I get on to some questions from the audience, I had a few of my own. My first question is, how do you consider faith to be a part of the society, and whether you find faith to be an absolute good, or you don't think that is so?
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot, Ajay, because Christianity gave Baroque art, but it also gave the Crusades. Islam gave fantastic Persian calligraphy and beauty, but it also is in its current avatar is in a difficult position. Hinduism too, we have both the good and the bad. So the easy answer would be both. But if I had to pick in my after this book, I would say that faith has done more good for this world than bad, if I had to choose. If I had to not do the caveat thing and say it is good and it's also bad, it's powerful in both senses. If I had to choose, I think because I think faith allows you to be bigger than yourself. Like I told you, the transcendence that faith offers. And then Time Magazine did this cover story where they linked faith to studies, scientific studies, and made a whole bunch of claims. I mean, well documented. And these were scholarly studies, not just made up ones. You will have a better marriage if you are faithful, your health parameters will be better if you are faithful. And this was written from a Western perspective, from largely Christian. I mean, the professors who did the studies were focusing on Christianity, but I would say that applies to. I did an informal study of my own. I asked my Chinese friends to ask their mothers where they would go if I offered them a 10-day vacation anywhere. And they had many things. They said, we'll go to visit we want to play mahjong if we have vacation. And then I would guess that Indian women, if you give them a vacation, they wouldn't play mahjong or play golf. They would all say, I want to see Jyotirlingam. I want to go to the Char Dham. So faith is rooted in India. And I think even though it is a source of much harm, I think it's also good.
You did mention what your mother told you, Bhavana and Sharanagati. While you did talk a little about Bhavana, the imagination part of it, do you think that the aspect of Sharanagati in faith is a good thing? Because Sharanagati would mean that you're surrendering something. And
yeah.
You're at the feet of God or whatever. Do you think that is one way of destroying one's character? Or it's a good thing that, you believe that you're not everything and there's something more to it than what it is? How do you interpret?
Yeah. So I'm not at Sharanagati yet. I think the Bhagavad Gita offers a very good way of marrying the agency that we all like, Vikram, to the Sharanagati which is linked in the Bhagavad Gita to duty and karma. But the big things in life, as anyone who has lost a dear family member thanks to COVID, including me, knows, is that the really big things, who we are born to, who our parents are, what country we belong to, who our siblings are, the things that matter, the things that shape your character, the things that shape your trajectory of your life, when you die, these are all not in our hands, not in spite of all. So then I'm thinking, when you lose somebody close to you, what choice do you have? I mean, how do you make sense of it? So then I think Sharanagati would be a good thing to cultivate because it allows you to go on. But I'm not there yet.
Yeah. Good, Ajay.
Word become.
No, there's a question here saying, of course, how do you justify Abhishekam with milk and honey, etc., when people are starving? Is it not a hypocrisy of religion and faith?
There are so many hypocrisies of religion and faith, but I'm glad they chose a simple one. See, you have to figure out if you admire temples for holding on to tradition. And so one of the similar question would be, why are they burning firewood when the earth needs wood? Why can't they use gas stoves? Why can't they use solar? So the way that the temples make sense of the milk and honey Abhisheka is that they offer the Abhisheka. I mean, all of us go and catch that Abhisheka water and the milk. So, so then the question becomes, really the larger question you're asking is, do you like temples for preserving tradition, or do you think that all tradition is meant to be broken and carry on, move with the time, stop doing this Abhisheka with milk and honey, instead do 2 drops and then offer it to devotees? That depends on where you stand. I think that these temples are so hung up about preserving tradition that sometimes you have to allow the quote unquote, the bad to go in with the good.
In Hyderabad, we have a so-called visa temple where people visit after their US-America interview. Is slowly the customs of the past fading for new ones?
Yes, we have a visa temple in Chennai too, and I went to it before I went to America. We have apparently a temple in Mumbai where overnight trains from Ahmedabad can come and they deposit you there at that time. I think that's actually an evolution. I think that today's people have different concerns, unlike our ancestors who were worried about Indra and thunderbolt and rain. So I don't have a problem with that.
I would think, Ajay, statistically, we will find out how many visas were rejected after visiting.
That's a good way to do. That's a good point.
So, having said that, I have a thought here. You see, in the 1857 war, both the Hindu and the Muslim faith were tested because of something they did with food items. You know, a pig and a cow and what is made out of it. And I think the British played dangerously by meddling with food and faith simultaneously. So the question is, has something like this ever happened anywhere in the world where they tinkered with food and disturbed the faith?
As in the 87 war. I mean, the way I would venture to suggest that what is happening in Catholicism is something like that, where they are doing both, because the Catholics are questioning their faith and trying to evolve it in a way. With respect to the food, even though, I mean, sort of you take the bread and the wine, prasadams are very linked to Hinduism, Vikram. I couldn't find so it would, you would have to find a similar example in India. And I mean, local prasadams would be one way of tinkering with the food and the faith. But that's not happening. I think I can't come up with another example like the one you suggested, where people are changing the prasadams itself in order to make it more contemporary. So
I found an interesting connection with food and faith for 4,000 years in Israel. During passing over, they don't have bread because the Jews were asked to vacate, the Israelites, the Jews were asked to vacate their places in Egypt 3,000, 4,000 years ago overnight. So the tradition is they didn't have time to leaven the bread.
yeah.
So they just ran away. And now for those 4 days when they have the passing over, they don't have bread. So it's a wonderful way of connecting some event which happened 4,000 years ago and saying that you don't have bread because someone 4,000 years ago did not have bread.
Correct.
I think it's a wonderful way of, and I think it's very important to connect that way in tradition.
Yeah.
So the point which you made that between good and bad of faith, you would rather vote for the goodness of faith,
Yeah.
right? Even if it is not rational. Is it what you're saying?
I'm saying that if you had to, suppose I had the power to say, let's get rid of religion because it's bad. And if I had the power of choice, or you had the power of choice, and you had to do a pro and con, and make a list of all the bad things that have happened because of all faiths and all the good things that have happened, and you had to choose one or the other, if you had the power to allow faiths to continue, which would you pick? I would venture that some of us would say enough with this religion because it's created so many problems in the world. I am currently at a point where I feel that the good that all faiths have created outweighs the bad, even though there is a lot of bad that is happening in the name of faith. So that's what I mean. I mean that if you had a Tulabharam or a balance scale and you had to choose, I would choose for faith as rather than against. And I'm quite sure that many would choose against. Many would say the world would be a better place if all of us were atheist and all of us had no religious alliances. And I can see the reason for that, but I'm not that.
So you don't subscribe to the position that you took, that there would be an expiry date to religion?
I think, Ajay, if genetics goes the way it is going, and if prosperity goes, if you assume that all of the world will become prosperous and get beyond a certain whatever poverty line, I can imagine a situation where people think that we are in control, we don't need God anymore.
So are you saying that faith and poverty or misery are directly interlinked?
I'm saying that economic success of a country can make you forget the gods that were invented for a purpose that have no connection with your current life. I'm saying that um, the hold that religion is having on society is weakening, and that is everywhere. That is globally. The hold that society, the faith is having in largely Western culture. Middle East is a different matter, and in the East, if you look at the younger generation, unless they, I was going to say, if you look at the younger generation, most people don't identify with faith. So if you look at the coming generations, faith, the hold that faith has on them is very low, unless they become like me. It's kind of like coming back to it.
But how do you explain this? That we have vegetarianism and non-vegetarianism in India, and then now there's a growing imposition of faith and food, saying that it almost suggests that gods were vegetarian. That one extreme suggestion, and second, this fight on beef, because that is not Hinduism. How do you explain this contradiction that a large number of Indians are non-vegetarian, but still a portion of Indians believe that one kind of non-vegetarian food should not be eaten, connecting to faith?
I researched beef quite a lot for my book on cows, and I talked to scholars actually.
You can come here. I'll put my video.
I think that animal sacrifice existed in Hinduism. I think that I'm a vegetarian, but I don't think it is our place to talk about. I think what you eat is a very private matter. It is not the business of society. And I know that cows are somehow have become so linked to Hinduism that Hindus feel that they have the prerogative of telling others what to eat. I completely disagree with that. I don't think it's our business. I think faiths have chosen certain foods, and so be it.
In Ramayana, it is mentioned that Rama was offered by one of the ashrams.
Yes, and of course there is a famous quote by Yajnavalkya who says, "I eat beef occasionally when tasty." And I remember when I researched the book, I sourced it as well and talked to people about it.
Yeah, you think
there's an interesting question here. Sarveshwar Sipoy says, "I'm an anthropologist working amongst the Newars of Lalitpur district in Nepal. What would be the food item that you would associate with the Kumari goddess worship in Lalitpur?"
So I don't know if Sarveshwar, if you saw the video clip that I showed you of the Dasain festival, where it was men dressed as goddesses, and I saw each of them had an offering in front of them, and it was a mixed bag. It was like a thali. So for the Kumari goddess, typically I asked my guide, what do people take? And he said they take fruits and they take sweets. But why don't you give her Horlicks? And this is linked to one evolution that has happened in faiths. This is an interesting one. So during Navratri, typically, if you go to devout families, they will give bangles, they will give a mirror, they will give haldi kumkum. But nowadays, my mother said, why don't you give them a lipstick? Because the point is to make all these people feel happy. So offerings too have evolved.
Yeah. There's another question here, very interesting one. Why is the non-vegetarian and wine eliminated out of offerings in a Hindu temple? Is it the influence of Brahmins on all temples?
Yeah.
But having said that, I think there is animal sacrifice in the Kamakhya temple.
I was just going to say that. So if you go to the eastern part of India, Bengal and above, there are still, and in Kathmandu, I visited the Shiva temple, and there I saw a goat being sacrificed there. So I think the Puritanism that has come in Hinduism is Brahminical influence. Yeah, so I think that animal sacrifice, in other old texts which I've read, including Wendy Doniger's The Hindu, they say the whole notion of Agnihotra began with self-sacrifice. So essentially, you have to imagine you are jumping into the fire to offer yourself. And then they had the Ashwamedha Yagna, where the horses were offered, the cows were offered for the sacrifice, for the Agnihotra. And then only now we have the Samitir, which is the grains and the cow dung and the ghee. So it's a much watered down version of sacrifice. So sacrifice began with self-sacrifice. So to answer Vikram's earlier question, there were cow whisperers. They were called Samitars. They would go and allow they would calm down the animal to sacrifice it. That's been documented.
Yeah.
So someone is asking, some temples don't allow people from other faiths to enter without permission. For example, Parsis. Is there any temple or place of worship that is on your bucket list and you have not gone?
Actually not. I have been to the Grand Mosque in Turkey. I have visited the Parsi temples of Mumbai for this book. I have visited Jewish temples in America, Jain temples. So actually not.
There's a good question here, and I think this is something which has been bothering all of us for centuries together. Could you figure out why food cooked in temples tastes much better than anywhere else?
If you ask the Swaras at the Jagannath temple, they will tell you it is because we are told to eat and come and then chant the name of the Lord when we cook. So this is something. So I covered restaurants as a journalism, So there is this whole notion of the temperament of the cook, and for us in India, we pay a lot of attention to that, which is why people chant as they cook. If you go to the Hare Krishna temples, whereas you go to a restaurant kitchen, especially a restaurant that's been given a star by Guide Michelin, everybody is cursing, people are throwing things around, they're cursing in French, and the food that comes out is delicious. So then what does that mean? To me, what it means to how to make these two opposites, Sattvic food, non-Sattvic food. That's how I wrapped it around my head. And I think that's why temple food tastes better. Temple food keeps for longer. Temple food makes you, is lighter. It is in this day when we are all so worried about intermittent fasting and we're doing detoxing and everything. I think temple food is Sattvic, and therefore you feel better.
No, but temple prasadams are not Sattvic. They have enough ghee and oil and...
Yeah, sure. No, I meant, Vikram, my point was not about the ingredients of the food. My point was about the temperament of the people who make it. Can you transfer the ethos of the kitchen to the food, assuming the ingredients remain the same? Because whether you go to a restaurant or a pizza or something, let us for a minute have as a control group that the ingredients are all tasty and therefore high fat and therefore with the ghee that you all say. Why is it that temple food keeps better or tastes better? Then the only other variable is the temperament of the cooks, and that is what transfers the Sattvic feeling, is how I wrapped it around my head. Because certainly the cooks in restaurants are stressed out, but the food that emerges...
Did I hear you right in your speech where you said that about only 15% of Indians are believers?
Yeah, you can look it up. I think, no, 15% are atheist, reverse.
15% are atheist.
Yeah, in India and Thailand, we are a very devout country.
Yeah.
My good friend Hitesh narrates an incident, and I would like to read it out. Many years ago, he had a meal in the Lord Jagannath temple in Puri. And the Panda who served him said this, many lifetimes hence, when you are blessed with eternal knowledge, perfect memory, and divine understanding, you will realize that having this meal in the temple of our Lord Jagannath has been the most auspicious event that has been bestowed through his grace on you across many lifespans. So in a single statement, he's covered many lifespans and focused it on a single meal, which is on the prasadam, which is served.
Yeah.
I think it's a very thoughtful exercise for the Panda. And I can imagine the impact it would have had.
But that's what that Swami Avdeshananda said, no? He says that worship makes you sensitive to energies and feelings that you don't have now. So in order to be sensitive and even realize that this meal is important and perhaps the best thing you've had over many lifetimes, you need to cultivate that sensitivity.
In today's troubled world, you cannot avoid this question. So the question is this: whether religion is coming in between the secular fabric of our country in present times, and whether the majoritarian culture is trying to impose its will on other cultures.
100%. And I'd like to repeat what I say in the book, that I'm a deeply secular person. I quote a MLA from the state of Goa who says that at home I may be a Hindu, but when I walk out, I'm a Indian first and a Hindu last. I think that's a good way to live. So yes, 100% religion is coming. I think I don't know what was I don't know when it happened, whether it was 9/11 or 9/11, certainly in America. I was living in New York then. The day after, my friend Aisha, whose daughter goes to my daughter's school, came with the hijab for the first time. And I said, Aisha, what are you doing? She said, I am in solidarity with Muslims who are being hunted now as perpetrators. So that was a fork where she decided that she would choose her religious identity over her. She was a US citizen. So I think now people are being forced, or people are choosing to make these choices where they choose faith over nationality. I'm not sure that's a good path to go on. It's happening in India. It's happening everywhere.
One last question is on the identity of communities and food, which also transcends religion and food. Someone's asking a question here because now you have Chettinad food, and I come from a community. We have some community specialities which the other communities don't cook. So, are these subcultures will they survive in this modern world?
If you like the vast and magnificent variety that is so much a part of India, you would want it to survive. And I happen to be of that mindset. I think so when you asked me, Vikram, to say, choose whether religion is good or bad, I chose good because I think religion is a embodiment of this variety. Religion is also a cleave, but as you say, the subcultures are part of the magnificent diversity of India. And I think if it takes faith to make them survive, by all means, we should have it.